Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video I want to take a look at a chapter by Thomas Nagel, and the chapter is called Death. And that's what it's about. Death. Specifically, it is about the question whether death is a bad thing for us. And Nagel starts by pointing out that you could have two very different points of view on this. On the one hand, you could say that except in maybe exceptional circumstances where people are suffering terribly, but normally death is very bad for us. It deprives us of everything that is valuable. It is basically the worst loss that we can suffer. On the other hand, Nagel points out, there are people who would say, well, no, if you're dead, you're not there, and so you're not suffering any loss. Right? There is no such thing as experiencing the badness of death, suffering from death, and so on, because you're not there. And this is in fact a famous phrase from ancient Greek philosophy, where Epicurus said that you shouldn't be afraid of death, because when you are there, death is not, and when death is there, you are not. Right? You and death, in a sense, can never meet. Okay. So on the one hand, death might seem to be very bad for us because we lose everything. And on the other hand, it might seem that we're not there to lose anything, and so it can't be bad for us. How should we think about that? Well, Nagel is going to explain to us a way of thinking that allows us to do justice to the fact that we are not there when death is there, and still believe that death is a bad thing for us. And Nagel starts by assuming that life is good. It's not the case that every life is good or that life is always good. I mean, there are the contents of life which can be more positive or more negative. But Nagel's base assumption is that life, as such, is an emphatically good thing. Right? Only if life is really filled to the brim with negative experiences might things tilt towards the negative. But even a kind of neutral state is still good and to be highly preferred over death. So if that's the case, then we might want to say that, death has to be bad because it takes away this life from me. And dying earlier must be worse than dying later because it takes away more of this good thing for me. Right? If I die at 80, I will have lost less life than if I die in some tragic accident at 25. So, yeah, death seems to be a bad thing for us, and dying earlier rather than later is a worse thing. Alright, but what about the problem that we are not there when we suffer this loss of death? Well, Nagel says, the assumption here would seem to be that something can only be bad for you if you are experiencing it. Right? Something can only be bad for you if you are experiencing it. And so death could only be bad for me if I'm experiencing death, but of course I'm never experiencing death. Now, Nagel's strategy is going to be to argue that goodness and badness are not just a matter of your momentary experience. They are a matter of how what happens relates to your whole life history. And it may relate to it in ways that you are not even conscious of. So, to look at an example of that, of something maybe harming you even though you are not even aware of it, Nagel gives us the example of betrayal. Right? Suppose that you are betrayed by your friends. Right? They are mocking you behind your back. They laugh at you. They make sure that everything that you want to achieve in your life will be immediately undone after your death. And they have great fun about this, and they throw parties where they make fun of you and ridicule you and generate these plans about how to, ruin everything that you made at the moment that you are in the grave, and so on and so forth. Is that bad for you? Supposing that you never find out, right? They're careful about it, you never find out. Is this bad for you? And Nagel tells us yes. I mean, being betrayed is bad. It's not that it's only bad when you find out that you are betrayed. In fact, finding out that you are betrayed gives you an unpleasant feeling because being betrayed is bad. It's not the case that being betrayed is bad because finding out about it might give you an unpleasant feeling. So, if Nagel is right about that, betrayal is an example of something that can be bad for you even if you don't know about it, even if you never experience it. Okay, here's another example that Nagel gives us. And this one is a bit closer to death. So suppose that instead of dying, I get into an accident which damages my brain in such a way that I start functioning on the level of, let's say, a 3-month-old child. But maybe a very contented and happy 3-month-old child. So I'm sitting somewhere in a room, I don't know, just looking at the colors, hearing the sounds, getting some food and drink, and I'm perfectly contented. Is this a good or a bad thing to happen to me? Well, if we look at it from the perspective of me after the accident, there seems to be no harm that I'm suffering, right? I'm contented. It seems to be fine. But I think almost all of us would say, wow, this is a terrible thing to happen to you. And what we are taking up is the perspective of me before the accident, right? We are looking at my life history, my position at that point, my plans, and so on and so forth, the being I am at that moment. And then we look at this continuation of my life. And from the perspective of my former self, the state of my later self is horrible. It's a tragedy. It's a loss that I suffer. Right? I suffer the loss of all my projects, my plans, everything I wanted to do and experience. It's all gone in favor of, being back at the mental stage of a 3-month-old. That's not good. And so again, Nagel says, it seems that all of us are already committed to the idea that something can be bad for you, even though it doesn't entail any bad experiences. Because at no point here am I aware that something has gone wrong, or am I experiencing kind of suffering or hurt? Alright, so that is the way Nagel says that we should also think about death. Death is a bad thing for us. Not because when we are dead, we are suffering, or something bad is sort of going on at that moment. Death is bad for us because from the point of view of this entire life history and this entire person that we have been during our life, the loss of possibilities, the loss of the possibility of sensation, of loving, of fulfilling our plans, or, even just of living itself, that loss is tragic and it's bad. So that is the basic model, right? The idea is that we can get around this tension in our thinking about the badness of death by pointing out that badness doesn't have to be a momentary experience. It can be applied to somebody's life whole, so to speak, and evaluated from that point of view. Now, at the very end of the article, Nagel asks whether this only works for premature death or whether it also works for people who die at what we might call a ripe old age. Right? It's bad to die at 20, but is it also bad to die at 80 or 90 or 100? Is it bad to die once, let's say, your natural lifespan, the time allotted to mortal man, has played out? Well, Nagel says, you can take sort of two perspectives here. There is a kind of external perspective from which you can say, oh, well, human beings have a natural lifespan, dying at 80 or 90 or even 100, that makes you pretty lucky. In fact, maybe you should be thankful to have lived until that age. And so it's weird, maybe it's wrong, maybe it's false to claim that there's any badness going on there when you die at this ripe old age. But, Nagel says, that might be how things look from the outside. It doesn't have to be how things look from the inside. And I'd like to read, this is from the last paragraph of the chapter. Here's what he writes. He says, the situation is an ambiguous one. Observed from without, human beings obviously have a natural lifespan and cannot live much longer than 100 years. A man's sense of his own experience, on the other hand, does not embody this idea of a natural limit. His existence defines for him an essentially open-ended possible future containing the usual mixture of goods and evils that he has found so tolerable in the past. So here's what Nagel's pointing out to us. When you are living, you generally do not experience your life as sort of tending towards a natural endpoint, right? You're always open to a future that seems to contain many, many possibilities, many possible experiences, which you have generally found valuable. And this process of life, right, as far as you are concerned, seems like something that could be going on and on and on, maybe indefinitely. And so if we look at ourselves from the inside, and surely when we are thinking about death, we are at least in part thinking about it from the inside, right, contemplating our own mortality, our own death, there seems to be no reason not to think that death is bad for us, even at a ripe old age of 90 years or 100 years or even older. Of course, it could be the case, I suppose, that at some point you think, no, I've had enough, right? And if you really feel that you've had enough, then maybe life is, no longer worth living and maybe death stops being bad. But that doesn't seem to be, at least according to Nagel, there's no sort of necessary element of human life that would make it the case that all people always think like that, or have to think like that, or ought to think like that, right? There is nothing contradictory or inexplicable about feeling bad about death, even when you are very old. And so Nagel, not in this text, but I believe he writes about this in one of his later books, basically claims that immortality sounds pretty good, right? That it might very well be the case that you live a life where at every point death would seem to be bad and life would seem to be good.